This is happening. Oh, here we go. I finally got it on. This one's good.
Good afternoon. My name is Donna Devine. I'm with CSER, and I want to welcome you, those in person and those who are participating virtually, to our presentation today. I'm so glad that you're all here and interested in learning more about refugee resettlement. There we go. There you go. Do want you to know that this presentation is being recorded. We're not going to have any breaks because we've got a lot of information, and I'm hoping you'll have a lot of questions that we can answer. So feel free to use the restrooms whenever you need to. You go out the doors and to your left. At home, you probably know where the restroom is. If you want to, you can stand and stretch in the back of the room. It's just fine. It'll be very casual. Please remember to observe the COVID safety measures. And for those in person, if you haven't got your parking ticket validated, you can do that before you leave today. I want to let you know that CSER catered our lunch today from Jerusalem Cafe. The owners are the Alaza family, who are immigrants from the West Bank and Palestine. Just to give you an idea, our keynote speaker will speak first during the first half of the presentation, and then the second half will be a panel presentation from the 3 resettlement agencies in the Kansas City metro area. And CSER will follow up with any materials that the keynote or the panel presentation members note, or say if they have more information, we'll be sending that to you. So again, thank you for being here, and we'll have a few more introductions and then we'll begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Valdivino. I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of the KC Chamber, welcoming KC and CSER, thank you very much for being here. This is one of many events that we're holding as part of Welcoming Week. If you're not familiar, Welcoming Week is a series of events from September 10th to September 19th to celebrate the contributions, the heritage of our immigrant and refugee populations. So we started the week with an event on Friday where we did a taco royale, sort of a taco trail around the Central Avenue area. And our good friends from CABA definitely helped us put that together. And we want to thank them for all the work that they did in allowing us to be in their backyard and working with the immigrant and refugee restaurant owners there. So be on the lookout. We have, besides this one, we have several other events for the rest of the week with some of our coalition members. And so thank you so much for being here. We look forward to a great presentation and a great welcoming week. Thanks.
Welcome. Good afternoon. I am Andrea Perdomo Morales, the Chief Health Equity Officer at Vibrant Health in Kansas City, Kansas, and the co-chair of Communities Concerned for Immigrants and Refugees, or as many of you will hear it today, for short, CCIR. CCIR is a learning network working to strengthen the health and well-being of immigrant and refugee communities. CCIR strives to help make Kansas City a welcoming community for all who live in the greater Kansas City area. The event today is one of approximately 350 events taking place this week across the U.S. in recognition of Welcoming America Week, as Greg mentioned. Before the presentation begins, I'd like to thank the Reach Healthcare Foundation for making immigrant and refugee health a priority in their funding strategies. With research and community input, the Reach Healthcare Foundation board members made a commitment to invest resources to create and sustain CCIR, which provides learning platforms such as this one today. I would also like to thank the CCIR health advisors. Their input is invaluable in this work. CCIR has a strong track record of providing relevant and up-to-date health and wellness programming and information to those concerned about making a positive impact in Kansas City. Additionally, CCIR thanks the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce for being a wonderful partner of the Welcoming KC initiative and has provided this beautiful space and staff to support our event today. A big thank you to their staff and team. Our hope is that each attendee will come away with a better understanding of the U.S. policies and procedures that impact refugee arrivals to the United States, as well as Afghan special immigrant visa recipients. Our keynote speaker will share information covering the time people leave their country of origin and are determined to be refugees through their arrival to the U.S. Our local refugee resettlement agency representatives will address the resettlement actions taken locally to make Kansas City a welcoming place to live. Woven throughout will be information to help us better understand the unique circumstances of Afghan special immigrant visa recipients. A CCIR community health advisor once stated, "It is so important for us to come together to learn and find ways to act in the best interest of our community. We must be prepared with good information to stand up to injustice and misinformation." So with that, we want to thank you all for your time and being with us both here in person and virtually. And I will turn it over to Donna again to introduce our featured speaker for today. Thank you all very much.
Okay, so I truly believe that we are so fortunate to have exceptional and acknowledgeable speakers today who are leaders in the refugee resettlement efforts, given how busy of a time this is with the recent activities in Afghanistan. Our keynote speaker is Kristen Aster. She is the Director of Client and Community Engagement of the International Rescue Committee, Resettlement, Asylum, and she works out of the Resettlement, Asylum, and Integration headquarters. She has a bachelor's degree in international studies and a master's from Georgetown University in public policy, and also a certificate in refugee and humanitarian emergencies, which I didn't even know existed, but it's awesome. She's also a Fulbright scholar, research, and in her study, she researched refugee and immigration issues in Morocco. She's applied her wealth of knowledge and studies to actual action and being involved in the refugee resettlement efforts. She's been a policy and advocacy officer for the U.S. programs at IRC, where she was a lead on engagement with Congress and state level policy and advocacy. She provided advocacy support to IRC's 29 field offices. I mean, she has so many accomplishments. She served as Associate Director of Refugee Council USA. She's worked in external relations at the UNHCR in Washington and has experience at the Office of Refugee Resettlement and has worked with the International Labor Organization. So she has all these different experiences and have put them together to give us a wonderful presentation. No pressure, but she really does have a wealth of experience, and we are so fortunate that she has the time, given that schedules are so busy, and as well as our panel members to be here today. So, Kristen.
Thank you so much for having me and for the warm introduction. It's really my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Just going to get my notes set up. So just give me one moment to pull that up. Perfect. Okay. If we can go ahead and pull up the slideshow, great. No problem. So today, again, I'm so happy to be with all of you today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the global situation for refugees and displaced people around the world. I'll be talking a lot about the US Refugee Resettlement Program, and then I'll also be talking about the current situation of arrivals from Afghanistan, and we'll have time for Q&A as well. Great, thank you so much. So I work for the International Rescue Committee. If you're not familiar with the IRC, we were actually founded in 1933 by Albert Einstein. Clicked ahead. We were founded in 1933 by Albert Einstein, who you may not have realized was a refugee. So we were founded in the wake of the Holocaust, World War II, and really founded at Albert Einstein's request to help serve folks who were fleeing Nazi Germany. So we've been around, it's coming up on our 100-year anniversary. So something that we say makes the IRC unique is that we work all around the world. What we say is we work on the entire arc of displacement crises. So we work in many of the countries where people are displaced inside their countries, and many of the countries where refugees are fleeing from. We also work in the countries where people are fleeing to. And then of course, here in the United States, as well as in Europe, we work in the countries to where people can begin their permanent new homes if they're resettled or granted asylum. So we work in more than 40 countries around the world, and you can see some of the examples. So, sometimes use Syria as an example. We work inside Syria, and we work in refugee camps in Jordan and elsewhere in the region. We work in Europe as folks arrive on land or via sea from Syria, and we work here in the US as folks are resettled. So that's just one example of one particular refugee crisis where we work along every step of that journey. And then here in the United States, as Donna mentioned, we work in more than 25 communities in 15 states. So while we aren't in Kansas City, Missouri, we do have an office in Wichita, Kansas. And in Kansas, we manage the statewide program, the Kansas State Office for Refugees. And so we work closely, of course, with our Kansas City, Kansas colleagues. So I'm very happy to be here today with all of you. So just to give you a little bit of a landscape of the current state of displacement around the world. So the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, every year publishes new numbers for the total number of folks who are displaced around the world. And as you can see, it's a staggering number, 82.4 million people displaced around the world. That includes over 26 million refugees, so people who have fled their homes and crossed a border. It also includes more than 48 million internally displaced people, or IDPs. So people who may have fled for very similar reasons as refugees, but they're still inside their country. So they had to flee their home, but they didn't cross a border. They stayed inside their country. There are also more than 4 million people who are seeking asylum, which I'll talk about in a minute, and nearly 4 million people, 4 million Venezuelans who've been displaced abroad, who maybe don't have the official classification as a refugee, but have been displaced. So you can see it's a staggering number, but one thing I always say about the power of the US Refugee Resettlement Program is that when you see numbers like these, you can think, it's such a huge problem, what can I do? And we really have the opportunity here in our communities to make a difference on things that are happening around the world right here at home. And I think that's one thing that's so powerful about the work that you all are doing, the work that we all do together around the country. So I'll go into some of the specifics and a few sort of interesting facts that people don't always realize. So first, unfortunately, as you can see, the number of displaced people around the world has been increasing year after year for many years. So it's a huge problem that's not going away anytime soon, which is why the work of the United States in welcoming refugees is so critical. We're such a critical part of the solution for people around the world, including the work that happens right here. So one piece of information people don't always realize is that today, the majority of refugees actually aren't living in refugee camps. There are still many people who do live in refugee camps, but actually over 60% of refugees live in urban settings. Also, about 42% of all displaced people are children, and hundreds of thousands of children are born every year in displacement, really elevating that need to find urgent solutions so that we don't have children staying as refugees for years on end. Just this last year alone, as you can see from these rising numbers, there were over 11 million people who were newly displaced just in 1 year alone, including over 1.4 million people who fled protection outside of their country who are refugees. And that's just in a single year. So again, it just really reinforces the need for solutions and the need for the work that you all are doing. So as you can see, these are the top 10 countries of origin for refugees currently around the world. And so the top 5, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar, they alone account for 68% of all of the refugees. So you can see that these countries in particular have particularly strong needs. Another interesting thing people don't always realize is that the vast majority of refugees, so people are fleeing their homes and crossing a border, are actually not in wealthier countries like the United States. These are the top 10 places where refugees are currently living. So you can see Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, etc. 86% of all refugees are actually living in developing countries. So it might change what you think. We know that the US is doing a lot, but we have much more we can and need to do, given the fact that most countries around the world that are hosting refugees, the vast majority, 86%, are those developing countries. And 74% of countries that are hosting refugees are actually neighboring countries to where refugee crises are. So just gives you a little bit of sense of, before refugees are able to find a permanent home, where most folks initially land. I also like this, this chart because, again, changes your perception a little bit about where refugees initially go. So this chart shows people displaced across borders per 1,000 people. So it's essentially looking at per capita numbers of where refugees are. And so you see some of the top countries are Aruba, Lebanon, Curacao. Here we go. The clicker is a little finicky. Can you try the next slide? Perfect, thank you so much. So in Aruba, for example, 1 in 6 people are displaced. In Lebanon, 1 in 8 people living in that country is a displaced person. 1 in 10 in Curacao, 1 in 15 in Jordan, 1 in 23 in Turkey. And so you get a sense in some of these neighboring countries, some of these developing countries, really the scale, not just in terms of numbers, but also the per capita scale of refugees that are being hosted. So when we talk about refugees and what does it mean to be a refugee? So I talked earlier about, a refugee is someone who has been displaced from their home and crossed a border. That's what makes them different than someone who's an internally displaced person. And there are 5 internationally recognized grounds by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, to qualify for refugee status. So it is because you have a well-founded fear of persecution based on your race, your religion, your nationality, your membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. And you can be recognized as a refugee. We call it prima facie. So let's say there's been an outbreak of a war in your country and you flee across the border. It's a recognized situation. This is something that's happening across the border. And there's also the individual status determination that happens by UNHCR, particularly before someone, for example, is referred for refugee resettlement. These are the 5 grounds, and this is also the definition in US law. Next slide, please. Oh. Perfect. So with 82 million displaced people around the world, over 20 million refugees around the world, not everyone is going to be resettled to a country like the United States. So we talk about 3 what we call durable solutions for refugees. There can be voluntary repatriation, local integration, and third country resettlement. So what we mean by voluntary repatriation is that, of course, if I had been forced to flee my home, I would ultimately want to be able to return. Unfortunately, for many people, that's not possible, but that's what it means to voluntarily repatriate, to return to one's home. So when you think about the over 20 million refugees around the world, in 2020, only 251,000 refugees were able to return home. So 251,000 compared to the more than 20 million around the world. It's a very small number. And this was actually the 3rd lowest in the past decade. That's really showing that, unfortunately, in recent years, this option of voluntarily returning home becomes less and less of an option for folks. The second durable solution is called local integration. So this might be you fled as a refugee to another country, and that country has made it so that you can stay there permanently, that you have some sort of long-term residence and rights, the ability for your kids to go to school, for you to be able to work, to have a permanent home there. There's not good data on local integration, so we don't have a full scope of how often that happens. There are some specific circumstances, but that's what that second solution means. And then third country resettlement, which we're talking a lot about today. This is when a person gets a chance to be brought to another country to have a permanent home, to be resettled. This is only a solution, though, for less than 1% of refugees around the world. I'll be talking a little bit more about that, but just wanted to talk briefly about that. I do want to flag that with so many refugee crises around the world, and many of these crises are protracted. What I mean by that is that UNHCR defines a protracted refugee crisis as one in which at least 25,000 or more refugees from the same nationality have been in exile for at least 5 consecutive years in a host country. And so based on this definition, it is estimated that nearly 16 million or 76% of refugees were living in protracted situations. So just think about that. More than 3/4 of the world's refugees are living in situations where other folks have been in exile for at least 5 years, and in many cases longer. Again, really reinforcing that need for solutions. So as we dive in particular today to talk about refugee resettlement, as you can see, resettlement spaces around the world are very limited when compared to the large number of refugees that we were talking to. So in 2020, all around the world, only 34,400 refugees were resettled. Only 34,000 compared to the millions around the world. And this was a decrease. It's only 1/3 of what happened the year before. This is due in part due to COVID-19 with border restrictions. But again, we've had such a low year in terms of refugee resettlement spaces. The US was not the only country that resettled refugees. So there was refugee resettlement that took place in 21 countries around the world. And last year, roughly 1/3 of those folks came to the US, about 1/3 went to Canada, and about 1/3 went to European countries. So I'll talk in particular about the history of the US refugee resettlement program. So I'll talk about, in particular, the formal program we have today. But I do want to make note, particularly given the reason we're all gathered here today, is that American communities have been resettling refugees for decades. So when I talked about the founding of the IRC in the 1930s, my colleagues here today who are part of agencies, they're also founded many, many decades ago. Even before the US government began its formal program, American communities and groups like all of you were doing the good work of helping refugees start new lives here in safety long before we had our current official program. But the current program we do have now was formally started with the Refugee Act of 1980, signed by President Jimmy Carter. And so a bit of the context at that time, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War between 1975 and 1979, some 300,000 Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees were able to come to the United States through presidential action because the law at that time restricted refugee admissions. And so seeing this, Congress wanted to start a formal program that would also be flexible and respond to global needs. And so the Refugee Act of 1980 was passed, I believe, unanimously in the Senate and created the formal systems that we have today that I'll be talking about. Of course, throughout time, technologies and protocols, et cetera, have been integrated, but the formal system that I'll be talking about is the president setting the number of refugees each year in consultation with Congress and the federal agencies partnering with communities like yours to resettle refugees began with this Refugee Act of 1980. So before I dive into some of those details, I sometimes like to pause and really talk about, why does the US resettle refugees? We've already talked about the global scale of humanitarian need. Of course, that's such a huge component of why we do this work. It's also, a good decision by our country for other reasons. It helps with our national security and foreign policy goals. So as we talked about earlier, so many developing countries host refugees. These are countries that have many other needs of their own. And so by the US saying, we're going to take some of these refugees to have a permanent home, we help relieve the needs of those other hosting countries. We help set an example for other countries as we encourage them to also resettle refugees and relieve pressure for needs to serve refugees in some of these neighboring countries. We're really able to show our leadership in that way. And it really corresponds with who we are, I believe, as a nation. We were founded by people fleeing persecution, right? We were founded by immigrants wanting to start a new life here. And so I always think of the refugee resettlement program as really harkening back to who we are as a country and why we are founded and our core values. And also, as you can see about some of the folks here, I talked about Albert Einstein, Madeleine Albright, our former Secretary of State, Sergey Brin, the founder of Google. These are also folks who have contributed enormously to our country, to our economy. And so while refugee resettlement, the goal of it isn't economic contributions, we've been able to benefit so much from the contributions of folks who have been able to come here and establish new lives. So I like to talk about that. It's not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do for our country in so many ways. I also like to point out that, as we know, we see this every day in our communities, refugee resettlement has such strong bipartisan support. It always has. And throughout time, from Ronald Reagan to George Bush to Barack Obama, we've had really strong commitments throughout the years to refugee resettlement. This isn't a partisan issue. It's something that all folks of different backgrounds get behind and support for all the reasons we've been talking about. So this gives you a sense of refugee resettlement over the last several years from the Refugee Act of 1980 until today. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a second about what the presidential determination is, but you can see that blue line shows essentially what our goal is each year for refugee resettlement, and that orange line is where we've ended up. So as you can see, it's ebbed and flowed throughout times, with most recent years. Before this year, the presidential admissions goal was 18,000. And so you can see it's ebbed and flowed throughout time based on a variety of factors. So how is that goal, how is that target set every year? So it's a process that we're coming up onto now that it's September, that's called the presidential determination. And so based on what was set out in the Refugee Act of 1980, each year, the president will propose the number of refugees to be resettled in the upcoming federal fiscal year, so from October 1st through September 30th. And they have consultations with Congress to talk about why that's the proposed number, from which regions around the world we anticipate refugees coming from, and the rationale for that particular groups. I'm happy to go with, through any specifics if people have questions, but there are sort of three main categories. There's something called Priority 1, which is individual referrals by the UN Refugee Agency and others. There's something that's called Priority 2, which are group referrals, which I'll talk about in particular related to Afghanistan, and Priority 3 related to family reunification. And there are typically regional allocations based on our anticipation of resettlement from different regions around the world. So the process can start in a couple of ways. I'm going to talk about how UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, will refer cases to the United States and those other dozens of countries I was talking about for possible resettlement. So I want to make it clear, refugees don't get to pick where they're resettled. UNHCR will refer refugee cases for resettlement. These are the most vulnerable cases to a whole variety of countries. And again, like I said earlier, only 1% of refugees around the world typically will have the chance to be resettled. And so these really are the most vulnerable, the most critical cases. So maybe those are folks with urgent medical needs or survivors of torture or violence, human rights defenders, families with particular needs. These are really the most critical cases that are being referred to a limited number of spots around the world. They go through a whole host of vetting procedures that I'll talk about in a minute. And then if someone is approved for resettlement, the International Organization for Migration will arrange their travel. But I do want to note that in the United States, refugees actually have to pay back that ticket to the US government. So that's something people don't always realize, that even if their travel is arranged here, over time, refugees do have to pay that ticket back. And so that's something that's part of the US process. So if so when a refugee is referred to the United States, there is a very long and very extensive vetting process that occurs. So more than 8 federal government agencies are involved in the vetting, numerous security checks across a variety of databases. There's numerous background checks. There's numerous biometric checks, so eyes, fingerprints, variety of biometrics. There's interagency security checks. There's at least 3 in-person interviews that take place, and all of these processes can take 2-3 years, sometimes even longer. So it's extremely thorough, and folks across the government are involved in thorough vetting of everyone who comes to the United States. Also, before folks arrive, there's medical screenings that take place. There's also more medical screenings that take place after folks arrive. And I'm sure some of our local partners will talk about the local processes for that. And there's also cultural orientation that takes place both before people arrive and after they arrive here, both to have a sense before they depart about what to expect about life in the United States, because the realities of having to start over and find a job, perhaps in a new field, learn a whole new way of life and a new home, it takes time, and it's not what we always see in popular media, for example. So really prepping folks before they arrive. I saw one video of a colleague doing cultural orientation in Africa, for example, and folks were going to be coming to, in the middle of winter, to a place with snow, and folks hadn't experienced snow before. And so passing around ice cubes, for example, to try to give people a sense of what it might feel like in winter. Or I used to live in Washington, DC, and I was with a colleague was a former refugee, and she hadn't seen the leaves turn in the fall before, and we were by the White House, and my colleague asked if they had painted the trees for the president because the president lived there, and just and I thought that was a very sweet anecdote, but also just those little things of the the new things that no one has to learn when one comes to an entirely new community, whether that's new weather patterns to how to get around town, to learning how to use all the things in one's apartment, all the critical services my colleagues will be talking about in a few minutes. So just lots and lots of things to learn, and just incredible resilience and contributions of the folks that are coming here. So the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is firmly a public-private partnership. And so once folks are approved by the U.S. government to be resettled to the United States, there are 9 national nonprofit organizations that then work with local partners around the country, more than 200, to serve refugees. So mine is one of them, the International Rescue Committee. You see the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which Catholic Charities is under, Church World Service, the Ethiopian Community Development Council, which Della is a part of, Episcopal Migration Ministries, HIAS, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, LARS, and World Relief. So these are the 9 national umbrella organizations that then have affiliate offices all around the country that work with refugees locally. So essentially these 9 agencies, before the beginning, roughly before the beginning of each fiscal year, are approved by the U.S. government to serve a certain number of refugees that year. And so like I was talking about before, the president proposes a number, consults with Congress, and then finalizes what that number will be for the year ahead. And refugee resettlement agencies consult with their state refugee coordinators, state refugee health coordinators, their local stakeholders, and talk about proposed admissions levels in the year ahead. And then the State Department takes all of that feedback, and each agency has a certain number of nationally, and an estimate locally as well as how many will be coming in the year ahead. And those consultations then throughout the year on numbers and what to inspect, et cetera, happen quarterly. So there's consultation at all levels of government and across both between the agencies nationally and locally. And when folks are placed, a lot of times that is a result of if someone has a family member in that community. And there are other factors such as, are there the key services available locally? Are there folks who speak the language of that family who's coming in? Or if does a family need particular medical care and there's a really strong healthcare provider, healthcare partner locally. So it's a mix both of if someone has a US family tie, of course, then someone will go where that location is. And then if they don't have that tie, looking throughout our various networks, where are there the capacity and the services needed to support that particular family, because we do get some information about that family's composition and their particular needs that will inform where someone is placed. And then a local agency will get notification about someone being assigned to their agency locally, and they'll begin that process of preparing for that family, which colleagues will talk about. So that's sort of the umbrella roughly. These are the 9 agencies nationally that work with partners around the country. And you can see the map here that refugee resettlement really happens all around the country. There's more than 200 sites all around the country that are resettling refugees. The top 10 states in recent years have tended to be California, Texas, New York, Florida, Washington, Minnesota, Arizona, Michigan, and Georgia. So some of the top 10 countries. You really see it's all across the US, all communities, a variety of communities around the country. So there are 2 primary federal agencies that are involved in funding and managing the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. So it's the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Health and Human Services. And so my colleagues will be talking more about the different programs and services they offer. So just at sort of a high level, The State Department provides limited funding for the first 30 to 90 days of a refugee's time here in the US. So it's the initial funding that's provided through refugee resettlement agencies to help refugees find that initial apartment, get it furnished, have a warm meal waiting, pick them up from the airport, begin that cultural orientation process, do their healthcare screenings, get any access to healthcare folks need, get kids enrolled in school, all of those initial critical services and assistance in that first 30 to 90 days. Then after that, the Department of Health and Human Services funds programs for up to 5 years for refugees as well as other populations we'll talk about in a minute. And these are programs such as focused on employment. So you might hear about the matching grant program today and other employment services. There's limited up to only 8 months of cash and medical assistance that is available depending on the family's eligibility. The refugee resettlement program is really focused on folks finding jobs as quickly as possible and becoming self-sufficient as quickly as possible. There's funding for programs to help schools that serve arriving refugee students, to some programs that help with refugee gardening or small business startups, for example, or with recertification for refugees who come with a higher degree and want to be able to continue that profession here in the US. So some of that funding flows through state agencies to then the local refugee resettlement agencies. Sometimes agencies then also can apply for specific projects within HHS, but that's the other primary federal agency that the funds typically, either, like I said, either flow through the states or the counties, and sometimes directly to the agencies themselves. And I won't go into a ton of detail because I know talking about the local services is what my local colleagues will be talking about. But again, just to reinforce, it's really the whole suite of services to help folks get oriented to their new communities, get their needs met, and really become on that path to self-sufficiency. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement is the office under the Department of Health and Human Services that specifically oversees programming and provides funding for refugees as well as other humanitarian populations. So I thought I'd touch briefly on some of those other populations as well. So a refugee, as we've been talking about, is someone who's resettled who is outside the territory of the US at the time of their application, essentially. Whereas asylees are folks, if someone is granted asylum, they still have to meet that same definition of what a refugee is, but they've already come inside the US. So maybe they present themselves at a land border or in the airport, or they're here in the US and their circumstance in their country changes. So they're already here inside the United States. So again, they have to meet the same definition. They just start at a different place in the process that's a little different. So in FY20, federal fiscal year 20, the US resettled 11,841 refugees and a little over 30,000 individuals were granted asylum. The Office of Refugee Resettlement also serves a couple of other populations. So they also serve special immigrant visa recipients. And so folks might be aware, these are folks who worked for the US mission, either in Afghanistan or Iraq, and then faced persecution as a result of their service to the United States or affiliated agencies. And so in FY20, there were a little over 11,000 SIV recipients and their families who arrived to the United States. The Office of Refugee Resettlement and its partners also serve unaccompanied children. So children who arrive alone to the US border and are seeking protection and are put in under ORR care or in the care of a foster agency or a family member while they wait the outcome of their immigration case. And ORR also serves survivors of trafficking, as well as some other populations. But these are some of the, the primary populations that ORR serves. I thought I'd also show you briefly, in this last fiscal year, these are the composition of folks that IRC resettled, both refugees and SIV recipients. So you can see the majority, nearly 60% were folks from Afghanistan. There were about 55% SIV recipients and 45% refugees. So nationally, across all 9 resettlement agencies, there was 21,534 refugees and SIVs who arrived. IRC resettled refugees and SIVs from 35 countries in FY20, with the majority coming from Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burma, and Ukraine. And I also wanted to flag, before I talk a little bit about the current situation of Afghan arrivals, that as we talked about earlier, the Refugee Resettlement Program is a humanitarian program. And at the same time, we see in our communities and around the country how much refugees contribute to our country. And so there have been many reports that have shown that after that limited initial contribution by the federal government and by many partners around the country, that refugees will ultimately pay more in taxes than they ever receive in government and private assistance. So the New American Economy is one group that tries to track just how much that refugees contribute. And they cite that in 2015, refugee households around the country earned over $77 billion, with billions going back to the federal government and in state and local taxes. So refugees do strongly contribute to our economy. In particular during COVID-19, we've seen how refugees and immigrants are particularly overly represented in our essential workforce. This is one picture of some of our colleagues working with the county in Atlanta, Georgia, to provide COVID testing sites that we know that refugees and immigrants are providing such critical services always, in particular during COVID-19. So I did want to touch upon, and I'm happy to answer a question in particular, the current situation that we're seeing with arrivals from Afghanistan. So as folks have been following in the news, in July and August, the US government began a large-scale transportation of vulnerable Afghans, including those who worked for the US, out of Afghanistan to help them safely resettle here in the United States. So there is historical precedent for efforts such as these. As I mentioned earlier, in 1975, after the Vietnam War, and then in 1996, after the first Iraq War, the US government similarly used its parole authority to transport thousands of refugees and US allies to Guam, where they undertook their resettlement processing. So currently, what is happening is that Afghans who were assisted in their departure from Afghanistan first spend time on a US government facility in a third country, which the US government has says includes Bahrain, Germany, Kuwait, Italy, Qatar, Spain, and the UAE. And this is via publicly available information from the Department of Homeland Security, where they have initial processing and extensive security vetting that happens from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the State Department, the FBI, and other federal agencies. So that's all happening overseas before folks arrive. So then folks are transported here to the United States, where they are temporarily staying on one of a set of military facilities around the United States. And during that time, they are undergoing medical screenings and immigration paperwork. Upon completion of those processes, they are then assigned to a refugee resettlement agency to go to a final destination to receive initial support services. So this final destination will vary based on if they have a US tie here already, or what I mentioned earlier about what are the particular capacities and services available to serve arriving families. And there also might be some people who have arrived and they already have that family here in the US, and so they're immediately reunited and can begin those integration services. So in general, as folks are arriving, there are three categories of statuses. There's folks, for many years, the US has been resettling refugees from Afghanistan. Like we talked about earlier, Afghanistan has been one of the largest refugee crises for many years. So there are still refugees from Afghanistan being resettled. There are SIV recipients, so people who again went through the whole process of having their paperwork certified to show that they worked for the US mission and received persecution as a result. And then the folks who are arriving now from a third country to one of these US government facilities are humanitarian parolees. So they will have humanitarian parole currently for 2 years, and they will receive an initial set of services at their final destination. And over the next couple of years, there will need to be a process to pursue other humanitarian statuses, such as, for example, applying for asylum or another type of status. But they're initially coming with humanitarian parole for 2 years. So this is a lot of text on the screen, so I don't expect you to read all of this. But just to say that you may have seen a few months ago now that the US government created a special group within the refugee program called the P2 program for Afghanistan that recognized that there are particular vulnerabilities that folks from Afghanistan who worked for US affiliated NGOs, for example, or media organizations might face as a result of their work. And so the SIV program, as well as the P2 program within the refugee program, there's different qualification components and things that have to happen, but just to emphasize and reinforce, they both recognize the particular persecution and vulnerabilities that Afghans who are affiliated with the US or the international mission and other organizations and NGOs might face as a result. So different specifics, but sort of the same overarching recognition. So my colleagues will talk about more of this in more detail, but just to say that as these Afghan arrivals ultimately get to their final destination, they will receive an initial set of services such as assistance finding temporary and then permanent housing, initial basic needs such as clothing and furnishing, accessing healthcare and other services, enrollment in school, cultural orientation, and legal assistance. At this time, though, these parolees, these parolees are not eligible for some of those longer term services funded by Health and Human Services that we talked about earlier. And so in particular, having that strong community support that my colleagues will talk about will be really critical for these folks. And I love this picture of a 3-year-old girl who went with her parents to greet a set of Afghan arrivals in our Sacramento office. Again, just really showing that no matter what age you are, you can be a part of welcoming refugees. So with that, I've been talking a lot. I know I throw a lot of facts and figures at you, but I'm happy to take any questions before we transition to my wonderful colleagues who are on the panel. Yeah. I know. Yes, I can make this available. And I'm sorry, I know it's a lot to cover in just a short amount of time.
There, it's on.
So if folks have a question, if they could just make sure this little machine is close to them, there's a push button at the front of it. And that way the individuals that are joining us virtually can hear. Kristen, we do have a question. How many children worldwide are refugees? I think you may have mentioned that number at the beginning.
Yeah, so it's roughly 42% of refugees around the world are children. So I don't have the exact figure, but I believe it was, pull it up. So there's 26 million refugees around the world and 42% of those are children. Donna.
When it's on its screen, that means you can talk. Red is
There we go. So if people have significant health issues, are they excluded because they're so great that it would be a burden for the United States to take care of all those things? Or
A great
how is-
question. No, in fact, one thing that's really important about the U.S. resettlement program is that we do prioritize the most vulnerable. And so sometimes having a significant medical condition would actually be a reason that someone might be referred to a country like the U.S. But the 9 resettlement agencies, not perfectly always, but there is medical information provided in advance. So the hope is that if there was a significant medical need, for example, that would impact potentially where someone is placed. So if there is a particularly strong, healthcare provider that has lots of experience working with refugees, for example, that would be sort of the ideal circumstance. We don't always have that perfect information on everyone's pre-existing conditions before they arrive, but that's the goal, that we do get some of that information based on their medical screenings before they depart, so that we can be ready to serve folks when they arrive.
Thank you so much for coming. Quick question. Since this is Afghanistanis we're talking about, religion is such a big factor.
Mhm.
I'm a Muslim.
Mhm.
My fear is where we resettle them, are they welcomed? And how do we make sure that their safety is priority? Because I've seen firsthand how we treat, when I say we, because I'm in America now,
Yeah.
how we treat, especially Afghanistan, of all the places in the world.
Right. It's a really good question. And I really appreciate you sharing about your personal experience. I would say that that this type of event and the work that community partners and stakeholders do, showing the outpouring of welcome and support is part of that work of making sure that folks of all religions and nationalities and backgrounds feel welcome here. I know I've been in this field for a long time, and this is definitely the most outpouring of support that I've ever seen. And so I think, as you mentioned, from personal things that you've seen and experienced, it just really reinforces how important it is for us all to come together and show support, so that as folks arrive, that they can see that no matter where they come from or what their background is, that they're welcome here. And I think particularly to work with the faith community, of all faiths, to show folks that welcome and to have a community support network. So I think that's, I love the welcoming networks and plans around the country, because I think that reinforces that there's a role that all of us can play, whether it's faith institutions, to chambers of commerce, to nonprofits, to individuals, in making sure that refugees feel welcome.
So just to follow up with that,
Yeah.
so that determines where you will resettle them because of religious preferences.
I wouldn't say that someone's religious background would determine where a person is ultimately resettled. About 60% of the time, someone has a US connection, like a family member. So that's definitely the dominant factor. And then if folks don't have a US tie, it's more based on things like, are there linguistic and culturally available services, for example? Are there those support networks? Do we have access to affordable housing? Are there other organizations in place that can help with different services that are needed? So I wouldn't say that a person's religion is a factor of where they're placed, but it's more like, do we have, the variety of linguistically and culturally appropriate services available, including, ethnic community-based organizations and other partners that will be able to help provide that best support, if that helps answer that.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that about 42% or something were children. And you mentioned some go through the foster care system. Where do the others go?
Yeah, that's
If
a good
not?
question. So 42% includes, children who are with their families. So many folks who are resettled to the U.S. Are families. So I can't remember off the top of my head, of those who come into the U.S. how many are children, but there are some programs that do serve children who are on their own. So there's something called the Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program. So there are refugee children who are resettled on their own. So perhaps they lost their family, like the lost boys and girls of Sudan, for example, or examples of kids who would have come through the URM program, the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, and would be placed with a foster family. And then the Office of Refugee Resettlement also serves unaccompanied children. So these are children, predominantly, though not exclusively, from Central America, who have made that dangerous journey on their own to the US border, and then present themselves seeking protection, and then are placed either under federal government custody for a limited amount of time, or in foster care, or with a family member while they await the outcome of their case, such as if they apply for asylum or other sorts of protection. So those are a couple of the different streams for children who are on their own.
You mentioned there was a section that worked with human trafficking and relocating. Is there a connection between the human trafficking and the refugees? Or is it just a separate group of people that you deal with? Kind of follow-up question, is there a big problem that you find with the refugees and asylees coming in and human trafficking?
That's a good question. So on the second question, I don't have the answer to that. I could try to find out about any sort of interconnection there. On the first question, so the US has visa programs for people who have been found to be victims of human trafficking. And so they wouldn't qualify for refugee status, but they receive protection from the US government if they show that they were a victim of trafficking, and then are eligible for this visa. And so within the Office of Refugee Resettlement that provides services to refugees and asylees and others, victims of trafficking also fall under their mandate. And so there are some special programs for survivors of trafficking, but sometimes I don't know actually if any of the local agencies serve survivors of trafficking. But for example, some of our offices that serve refugees also serve survivors of trafficking as well. Similar services of helping with psychosocial needs or healthcare or job placement. So just to say that it's under the same federal agency, the person might have a different status, and sometimes they'll be served by a refugee resettlement agency, and sometimes they might be served by another service provider, but the funding comes from the same federal agency that serves refugees, if that helps clarify. It's called a T visa, and there's also something called a U visa for victims of crime. There's a question.
What are the education levels of the refugees that the United States accepts or have accepted in the last 20 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the specifics on that. There is an annual report that the Office of Refugee Resettlement does that I can try to find as a follow-up. But just to say that it really varies, and particularly with folks coming from Afghanistan who were coming under the Special Immigrant Visa Program. These are often folks who can be fluent in English, have advanced degrees, and folks from Afghanistan aren't the only refugees that are arriving with those advanced degrees. And so in addition to help with initial job placement, and many of our agencies also work with refugees to help them either recertify or be able to apply their critical skills to workforce needs we might have across the US. So just to say that it can really vary, but there are folks coming in who have those advanced degrees, and there's definitely a need for specialized programs to help people to access those fields. particularly in healthcare, there's a big emphasis. I think we'll take one last question and then we'll transition to the panel. So, yes, sir. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you. You spoke about the states that where they are settled to. And it was surprising because the cost of living seems it would be high, California, Georgia.
Right.
Is there a change or to trend towards Kansas City, especially with the resources that are available, or states like Kansas, Missouri? Do you see that changing?
No, it's a good question. So affordability is something I know we all deal with, and I would say some of those states are have more refugees coming partly because they're just more populous states, but definitely having a diverse set of geographies where people can resettle is critical for a variety of reasons. And so as we look to scale up the refugee resettlement program to welcome more refugees and folks from Afghanistan, I'll let my local colleagues talk about all the work that they're doing to prepare locally. But just to say, there's definitely there's a need to have more options in terms of variety of locations for folks. And I'm sure as they'll talk about, and you all know, Kansas City is a very welcoming place. Yeah, so just to say that just because there's some of the bigger states that are welcoming more refugees doesn't mean there's a push to have those, be necessarily the top states moving forward. Definitely more than 200 sites around the country and looking to have more. Hope that kind of answers your question. So thank you. I'll leave it to my local colleagues, but I'll be around too if there are any additional questions. So.
Thank you, Kristen. That was very informative. And now we're going to move to getting more information or having a better understanding of what our local agencies are doing to help resettle refugees. On our panel is Danilo Aguilar. He is with Della Lamb Community Services. He is the Refugee Services Director. His background is in community development, domestically and internationally. He holds a master's degree in urban planning and policy, and he is the proud son of Salvadoran immigrants. We also have Casey Featherston. She's with Catholic Charities of Northeast Kansas. She's the director of Refugee and Immigration Services. Casey has 7 years of experience with Catholic Charities in the resettlement area. She's done teaching of cultural orientation, English, job readiness, and has been a resettlement manager. And we also have Naudi Solano Day with Jewish Vocational Services. She is the Community Integration Director, and she also has a background in immigration law and is a DOG accredited representative. She says she's not an attorney, so she wants you to know that, but she does do a lot of work with helping people with their citizenship, and she can talk more about that. She is an immigration paralegal. She has a political science degree from Georgia Southern University, and right now she's taking classes at UMKC in nonprofit management. So each of our representatives, and we're really, really, really lucky to have them here today. They are so busy getting ready, trying to understand all the new requirements, getting ready for our new refugees coming to Kansas City. So it's very, very beneficial. We're getting signals. I'm not sure what that means, but very beneficial that they are here with us. And they're each going to take an area of the resettlement process here locally. So while they talk about what they're doing in their agency, each of the agencies are doing similar things in their communities, but we decided that each one would take a specific area and share information about that. So I guess we'll just start with Danilo, and he can begin. And then there will be time for questions and answers.
All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here to represent Della Lamb Community Services. Thank you very much to the Chamber, and we're excited about Welcoming Week and to CCIR as well. And Donna for orchestrating, coordinating, I know, with the team. So we just really appreciate being here. I think I have a slide show there. Today, really what I'd like to discuss, as she said, just really thank you, Kristen. Also, that was, I wrote down a lot of notes too. Like, wow, I didn't know that. So she has that really global perspective, and that was very helpful. But just we're here to kind of describe what happens here down in the scene. And in my case, it's community integration or cultural orientation. And what does that mean? I think of it like my own experience. I lived abroad for a few years, and I lived in Portugal. When I got there, I didn't know how the kind of the gas, ovens worked and how that is. You actually had to go get a tank of like propane style gas, and I didn't even know how to order that, how to attach it. And these are those little things that you have to be taught, and luckily, and how to ride a bus and all kinds of stuff. I mean, you got to learn how to get oriented culturally, but also logistically, how you do things here in your new country or wherever you are. So today I'm just talking about towards a thriving refugee community is really what we're talking about. So really quick, Della Lamb has been in the Northeast since 1897. A fun trivia fact is that Della Lamb was a lady. That was an actual person. She was the first board president for it was called Neighborhood House, I believe. And then they changed it to Della Lamb in honor of her. And so what we do since the inception is early childhood education. It was originally for Italian immigrants up in Columbus Park area that they established this for. And then that developed into youth services. We have social services as well, which during COVID especially, we were able to provide a lot of food and a lot of resources for folks that were in need. And then finally, we have refugee services that we have been an official refugee resettlement agency since 2015. Since then, we've resettled from about 600 to 800. The numbers are there. I just saw them last week and I was like, it's different from what I thought. So 600 to 800, forgive me if the number is not exact. But we had actually been working with the refugee population in English for second language learners, actually for quite a while before that. And we're pretty well in that business there before. So since 2015, we've been doing this. And then next slide is cultural orientation. Yeah, that one. So cultural orientation is actually a requirement that all resettlement agencies have to do. All the 200 resettlement agencies that were across the map, we have to do that. And really that's just, I like to think of it, teach to empower, right? And empower is such a fancy word, but really it is how to integrate here and how to live here. How to make do here in your new promised land, in your new country, right? Once you get here, now what? So the things that we teach, you can go to the next slide as well, are a list of things that are actually required for us to teach. And some of those are finances, and that includes banking, credit, money management. You also have taxes. You got to learn how to do your taxes, and budgeting as well. And you can go to the slide that says overcome cultural and linguistic challenges. That'd be the next slide there. And so part of that as well, it has to be done within the first month of the arrival that they get enrolled into this. And then you have about 90 days or so to complete this initial cultural orientation. So funny enough, though, we kind of evaluated how we're doing, and one of our clients that went through the class, experienced what all of us do when you're working and you're trying to make do and make ends meet. He said, I go to the class and I understand everything when I'm in the class, but when I leave, I forget. And I don't blame him, right? Nor do I blame our teachers. This is something that across all the agencies we have to teach, and it's 10 things that are required. Again, it's English, it's how to find housing, how to hunt for jobs, US laws, also how the healthcare system, I don't know how our healthcare system works again. So it's just, I try to think of it like, this is folks just, they're here. These are human beings. These are people with families. Some of them, yes, are single, but they got families back home. It's just that whole, migration experience. So what we do is essentially take them through this class, again, where we teach situational awareness, because they got to know who we are also as resettlement agencies. What's our role in their lives? Can they trust us? Are we part of the government? Have they been able to trust the government before? So situational awareness, what they're doing here. Also English, mainly for employability, right? That's kind of the name of the game for the government mandated programs, is essentially self-sufficiency, right? You got to have income in order to live, especially if you have a family. Then you also need to be able to provide food on the table. And our refugee clients come eager to work and eager to learn English, and they're ready to go. I mean, like she said, it's just 1% of a very large population that makes it. And so when they arrive, you typically find people that are just eager and ready to go. So the English is for employability. That way they can find employment that's long-term. And again, right, I know right now on the news is the Afghan crisis, but this is a long game. This is a long-term process, right? Where we need people to think after the news cycle is over, that's really when things are going to start happening and people are going to start coming, and we're really going to need help as agencies across the Kansas City Metro. It's a long game. This is a long time. And finally, long-term transition. So after a while, my own experience, it was actually one of my favorite things to do, to drive to the local gas station and, go get that gas tank and, put it on. And so it's that long term. Okay, now I actually live here. I know actually what to do. So that's what cultural orientation is. Just really teaching people how to live here. It's kind of like when you go to a new school and you have your first day orientation, right? Nowadays they call it onboarding, right? But it's just how to be where you are now and how to live and work where you are now. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So that says refugee community advancement. Might have got transferred in the files. So that's what everybody has to teach, but kind of the philosophy that we're trying to adopt is, and where we want to bring in the very curious and generous folks that are really like yourselves, that are really trying to find out how we can be involved, is really what we want to see is refugee advancement. If you can go to the next slide. And this is basically cultural orientation as a philosophy. So when you're doing case management, some of the stuff that I tell our staff is there are things that we can do for people in 5 minutes because we know how to do it. And I don't want to use this as an excuse, but we are very busy right now with a lot of stuff going on. And so sometimes you gotta, can I just do that in 5 minutes and call the family support division and just get it over with? Or do I teach my clients, do I teach our new neighbors, do I teach our new Americans how to do it, right? And that might take 5 days, right? And so there's a balance. I'm not saying that we're perfect and we always teach, because sometimes we do not have time. I mean, just honestly. But the philosophy is cultural orientation as a way to work, right? And so what we want is to be, as a community and as Della Lamb, a trusted and engaged member of a thriving refugee community. So we want to continually advance the quality of life of our folks together with its members. So I think that's where you can be drawn in. If I can say anything, it's thinking of not just specifically an individual who is coming or a family that is coming. And case management is usually that specific individual, and let's get them from point A to point B or point Z or whatever, right? But really what we're trying to think of, what about the entire refugee community? Again, Kristen mentioned it. I mean, folks have been here for a long time already, and they're already contributing greatly, economically, culturally, everything to Kansas City. Right. And so go to the Northeast. If you want to try really good food, get up there, go. I mean, it's just on Independence Avenue and just choose a place. And it's really good. And so these are businesses that are owned by a lot. Well, they are resettled refugees. And so we know that our folks that come, they already have strengths. They made it through a very rigorous process and very terrible circumstances. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And so what we want is for our folks to arrive and thrive. And so, yes, they're coming and we are their lifeline for the first few months. But quite honestly, in that long game, what we're truly trying to go at is say, what are your strengths? What are your goals? And how do we connect, right? Faith-based institutions. How do we connect businesses? How do we connect the greater Kansas City community with the refugee community? And one of my goals is as well is get into the refugee community. We're making inroads where it's like this feedback loop, where basically those refugees who have made it or are making it, they actually could come back and we provide opportunities for them to teach and to train and all that. And we're starting to see that. And it's really exciting to be able to see that. And finally, for the last slide, it's for the future, quite honestly. It's the long game. We have little ones at Della that are children of refugees, as well as other families that we serve, not just refugee families. But essentially what we want to do is integrate, but in a positive sense of the term. I like to think of the United States not necessarily as the melting pot where we all dissolve into one soup, one glop, but I like to think of us as a salad, right? I haven't lost my Salvadorian flavor. I like pupusas still, but I also like hamburgers, so everybody has their flavor. We keep it, but we're one salad. So we got to work together. So the invitation is to the Kansas City community to work with refugee folks, look at them as people who have strength that are here. Yes, they need a lifeline. Yes, they need a hand, but not forever. And not victimized either, but I'm going to come alongside you. I'm going to walk forward with you. Finally, empowering their strengths, use your strengths, whatever resources you may have, but also their strengths. Our refugee families are folks that bring a lot, ultimately, for future little community champions like her, so that they can have a long-term success as a refugee community. Thank you very much.
Hey, Danilo is a pastor, so he is really good at public speaking. Okay. Hi, good. Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here. Very excited to share with you guys the work that JBS does daily. JBS was established in 1949 after World War II to help Holocaust survivors. So we have that in common with IRC. And JBS is broken down into 3 different departments. We have quite a bit of programs. So anyone that comes into our building gets a lot of really good wraparound services. So we have community integration, which is my department, and I'll tell you a lot about that. Workforce development, so we assist refugees and individuals with disability find employment and overcome barriers to employment. And we have health and wellness department with licensed clinical social workers who do trauma-informed care. They have groups that meet to talk about trauma or anything like that. We work with youth, we work in the schools. We work every day with case management to serve refugees and immigrants and those unaccompanied minors and victims of trafficking that we see every day across the metro. And then my program, community integration, which we work with refugees and immigrants. So along with all the wonderful refugee work that Casey mentioned and Danilo mentioned and Casey will mention, we have an immigration program that handles assistance with green cards and citizenship so that these folks who are trying to make it, trying to become self-sustainable, don't have to pay extreme amounts of money to attorneys. So we have accredited Department of Justice representatives who assist these individuals with their immigration matters, whether it be a green card or citizenship, or bringing their family member over that they unfortunately had to leave behind. We also serve unaccompanied minors in the way that when they come across the border and they are placed in ORR custody, as Kristen mentioned, their parents or their family members come to JBS to do a background check to make sure that they are a safe placement. So once they do the background check, we send it off to the federal government, and then family reunification happens. So that is a lot about the work that we do. JBS has been resettling refugees since 2004. And in the past 5 years, we have resettled 1,485 refugees, primarily from Congo, Burma, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Ukraine, Syria, and Sudan. And JBS has been resettling Afghan refugees and SIV since 2008. And so far, we've resettled 200 of that population. Yeah, so just a little bit more about the last 4 years, just so that you guys can get a sense of where we were in the last 4 years and where we're going now. In 2017, JBS resettled 415 refugees from 12 different countries. And then in 2020, we resettled 80. So that was a big drastic change. And then in just this last fiscal year, before July, JBS had resettled only 12 individuals. Between July and September 8th, we resettled 57. So things are changing. And just on the 21st alone is our next big arrivals. We have 29 individuals coming on just that day alone. So we have a lot of opportunities for the community to get involved, because as Danilo said, it is a community process. I think agencies right now, between the refugees that we have to resettle normally and with the Afghan crisis, I think it's the time to reach out to our community and let you guys know ways that we can work together. And so just a little bit on housing and school enrollments, which Donna asked me to talk about. I think housing is, we have wonderful community in the Northeast Kansas City. That is where you will find most refugees on the Missouri side. It is beautiful when you go there. There's a lot of different businesses, a lot of markets, a lot of restaurants, and a lot of homes. But unfortunately, the prices are going up. People are moving in. It's getting a little bit hard. So we are seeing that some communities are moving up north, some communities are moving south, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the supports are always there. So we're trying to meet that need now and making sure that if you know of a new landlord or someone who is willing to work with one of the agencies, let them know, reach out to them, reach out to your friends who have homes, who may own real estate companies, who are willing to cater to refugees in our community, because it's needed now. And with the Afghan crisis and more individuals coming to Kansas City, it's going to be needed a lot more. And with school enrollment, JBS is really lucky that we have those social workers in that health and wellness department, because they are out in the schools providing case management, providing therapy. But the cool thing about school enrollments is that they also assist with that. We are in the schools every other Tuesday to provide an orientation to families and those children that are enrolling, just to let them know what school is going to be like, what to expect, what the bus system is going to look like. There's a lot of really wonderful things happening with the school system here in Kansas City, where they're opening up a welcome center just for those English language learners and refugees to come and have a place, a hub to learn, for camaraderie, for language access. So letting families know about those services and what's going to happen. Oh, your kid is going to start at one school at 8 a.m., but they're going to go to, the welcome center at 12, just so that they know where their children are and what they're learning about. Yeah, it's a lot of wonderful opportunities here in Kansas City, and a lot of wonderful opportunities to get involved.
All right. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion. I feel like a really opportune time to be in front of so many people that feel like it's really important to be welcoming people to Kansas City as we, as arrivals increase just in general for refugees and folks that we serve, but also with the Afghan arrivals that we're anticipating to be arriving in the next days, weeks, months. So I'm really happy to be able to join you all today. And I'll just start off talking a little bit about Catholic Charities and then talk a little bit about refugee medical screenings, benefits that refugees are eligible for, and also employment services. So Catholic Charities has been around for a number of years. I should probably know when they opened their doors, but we've been doing refugee resettlement since 1980, so 4 decades of refugee resettlement work. But that's not all Catholic Charities is doing, obviously. We have family support centers that have food pantries and provide rental and utility assistance, wraparound case management services. We have asset development and economic empowerment programs that help people save for their futures. We have a workforce department that's helping people find jobs and helping them credential so that they can get higher wage positions. We also have adoption and pregnancy counseling. We have a foster grandparents program, which places older retired folks into schools and helps them be like mentors to children in the school district. And we also have our Shalom House men's shelter that is actually about to move to a new location. So we're really excited about that coming. In the Refugee and Immigration Services Department, we have our refugee resettlement program. We have our immigration clinic, much like JVS and Della. And we also have a lot of long-term case management programs, therapy services, counseling, all types of programming. And I put some brochures in the back so you can get the full scope of work if you'd like after this. So Catholic Charities, yes, has been resettling refugees, and those populations change over time as circumstances around the world change. So we've resettled folks from all over the globe, but most recently we've been focusing and seeing a lot of families from the DRC Congo. We have a lot of families coming from Burma or Myanmar. We also have been resettling Afghans for a number of years, either refugees or SIVs. Folks from Sudan, Central African Republic. We served Bhutanese families for a very long time, although they have mostly stopped traveling as most of them have been resettled in the United States or other countries at this point. We used to serve a lot of folks from Iraq and Syria, and we anticipate that those numbers will grow again with different changes in the administration. We've served folks from Cuba and Venezuela, Somalia, the list goes on. So today I'll just give you a little brief overview of a few different services and sort of what we're responding to here is trying to explain like what the reception and placement cooperative agreement requires us to do, and that's a grant with the State Department. And when a refugee arrives, the first 90 days they're enrolled in this program, and they're usually assigned a case manager, and there are a number of services that come along with that we're required to provide. So 3 of those services I'll cover today, which is the refugee medical screening. So as Kristen mentioned, overseas, they're going through this medical screening process. And so we're able to get a lot of the documentation from that, the overseas medical records, review those and kind of prepare for the medical needs that folks might be coming with. We're also able to share those with our medical providers that will do the medical screenings once they become stateside. And so that helps us kind of prepare for, if somebody might need a wheelchair, or maybe somebody's coming with a pretty serious condition and we actually need to take them from the airport straight to the emergency room. There's a lot of different things that can happen. Generally, most folks that are coming maybe have some follow-up care, but it's usually maybe follow-up within a month. So not so many urgent needs. However, they definitely occur. So each state refugee office contracts with healthcare providers in the local area. So on the Kansas side, we have Vibrant and Mercy and Truth Medical Missions. And on the Missouri side, I believe they're working with Samuel Rogers. And so within 30 days, we're scheduling appointments there so that they can get some follow-up medical care that they need. And at those appointments, they complete physical exams. They do lab testing, lab work. They'll get their vaccinations, and now they're being offered COVID vaccines as well. They do a mental health screening, tuberculosis screening, and then referrals as needed for ongoing care. What we know, and I'll try to like offset this with what I know so far about what we can anticipate with Afghan arrivals. So all refugee arrivals are eligible for medical insurance upon arrival. Right now, the Afghan cases are being given emergency medical insurance, and that will last up until the end of September, although that's not very far away. And we hope that there's going to be some legislative fix to make sure that their medical insurance will be extended beyond that. So medical screenings are being done overseas and then at the US military bases when they come for final processing. And then we're able to get those medical records and hopefully follow up with care there. So, and then benefits, just what types of benefits are families eligible for upon arrival? So first, all families, every individual that comes is eligible for up to $12.25 per family or per individual. So a family of 5 times 5, right? So they're generally eligible between $1,025 and $1,225, and then each agency gets to sort of decide where in that range they're going to allocate funds directly to the individual and how much they might hold back in an emergency fund. And that emergency fund can go to different families on the caseload within the year. So if one family has more urgent needs, we can reallocate a small percentage of those funds. So all families are eligible for SNAP benefits. So within 7 days, we're taking families on the Kansas side to DCF and getting them their food stamps applications completed. Families are all eligible for cash assistance, and that could be in 1 or 2 forms. Many folks are eligible if they have children under the age of 18 for TANF. And then if they don't have dependents under the age of 18, they're eligible for refugee cash assistance. So either group is going to be eligible for cash assistance for up to 8 months, and then potentially beyond if their circumstances deem it necessary. Then for medical insurance, all families are eligible for either Medicaid, CanCare in Kansas, or what's called refugee medical assistance if they don't have dependents. And that's also they're eligible for up to 8 months. And then there's like these additional services that people are eligible for, which is like WIC benefits. And we enroll those within 30 days, LIHEAP, public housing, Social Security insurance and disability insurance, and also unemployment benefits. So refugees are really eligible for the programs that all American citizens are eligible for in terms of benefits. And then conversely, the folks coming out of Afghanistan on this like parolee status are not eligible for any of these services at this time. So that feels like a very huge lift for us as a community and as resettlement agencies, because what I have heard though is that children under the age of 18 will be eligible for SNAP benefits, so that's positive. But I think we're all trying to solve the problem of how are we going to get families fed? How are we going to get them housed if they don't have reoccurring like cash assistance and food assistance coming in? So that feels like a really big challenge that we're trying to navigate. We are very hopeful that the government will come around and advocate that these folks should become ORR eligible, which will make them eligible for all the benefits that refugees are, all the programming that refugees are eligible for. So if you're into doing some advocacy, I would say that's a great starting point. Yes. So yeah, I think that covers most of the benefits. Last, I just wanted to talk about employment. All refugees upon arrival are work eligible, which is great. Sometimes we find with employers, sometimes it's easier once they have their Social Security and employment authorization cards, which usually come in the first month or so, the 1 month to 3 months maybe. But technically everyone is eligible to work with their I-94 document. It just usually takes a little bit of education on the part of the resettlement agency, working with the employer. And then the Afghan families, they will also be eligible for work in the United States. And they're actually, the USCIS United States Citizenship and Immigration Services Department is expediting their cases. So they should be receiving their employment authorization cards within 2 weeks is what I'm hearing, and I'm hopeful for that. Yeah, and so the reception and placement cooperative agreement requires that we make a referral to employment services within 10 days of arrival. And we think that's really important because self-sufficiency is so important. So we, do an intake, try to understand like what are the skills these families are already bringing to the United States? Where do they fit within like our employer network, or who should we be reaching out to expand our employer network so that they can find a job that they would really enjoy or be a good starting spot for them. Some of the barriers to employment are transportation. Obviously, that can be really tricky, especially in Kansas City where we don't always have the most, I think we all live in Kansas City and know the transportation situation. So that can be a really big challenge. Some of the other challenges are computer literacy for folks that maybe haven't had a chance to, go to school yet. Childcare can be a really common barrier for people, and language ability. But we've found that most employers are really ready to work with clients, even if their English proficiency is on the lower end. We've had really great luck working through that with employers and trying to set up like team leads that have a little bit more fluency, and then they oversee staff that maybe have less fluency. So that's been really helpful. Provide services that are provided by our agency, and I'm sure likewise across the board. We provide English classes, job readiness classes. We help with applications and the onboarding process so that people can go get drug tested or do that onboarding class. We also do resume development, interview prep, and transportation assistance. We spend a lot of time trying to coordinate carpools for groups so that people can get to work. And then interpretation services so that people can get onboarded correctly, understand the safety guidelines and all of those things. We work with a vast network of employers who have been really great, staffing agencies as well that have helped us plug people in to different jobs. So, I think to respond, I think somebody asked a question about what types of certifications folks are coming with. We see that people are coming with college degrees or high school diplomas, some professional licenses. Sometimes we'll see doctors, sometimes vets, sometimes engineers. Sometimes we place people in jobs that are paid triple what we make, and that's just wonderful. We're happy about that. And then also a lot of refugees actually end up becoming interpreters or translators for our agencies or for the healthcare field. So we see a lot of that, and there's a lot of great training that goes on at JVS to get people ready for those jobs, and we make a lot of referrals. And the types of jobs, I just got a quick list just for this last year to kind of give you an overview of what types of jobs we're seeing folks going. A lot of folks doing sewing, automotive manufacturing, warehouse and logistics, retail, meat processing, warehouse equipment operators, childcare facilities, construction and carpentry, and hospitality and laundry. And I believe our average starting wage right now is hovering around $14 an hour. So, it's not the 15 that we're trying to get everyone to, but we're making progress. I feel like every year that number goes up. So we're feeling really good that people are getting jobs that are sustainable for their families. And we see that about 75% of individuals placed in jobs stay in those jobs for beyond 90 days. And so they're really successful being able to maintain those jobs over a long period of time. I guess I might just, before we go to questions and answers, just talk about different ways that people can get involved. I think we're all really eager to kind of catalyze the energy that people have shown in the community to propel these families forward. I think this feels like an inflection point where there's so much good energy around us, and we want to make sure that people get plugged in and are able to support families as they'd like. So we're looking at a lot of different types of volunteer opportunities, whether that's transporting clients, taking them grocery shopping, going clothes shopping with them. We're taking donations. We have an Amazon wish list, but we're also taking housing donations. A lot of other, obviously cash donations are always accepted. And then we also have a community sponsorship program, which pairs like a community group. It could be a church group, it could be like a work-related group that want to do something. And we have 3 different levels of commitment. So some are just like setting up a new house and getting all the donations. So very simple, easy, one-time thing. And then it kind of grows from there, where you might be doing more community navigation with them, or you might become like a mentor to them. So there's a lot of different ways. And I put some brochures back there for our community sponsorship program, but that's something we're really excited about. And I'm sure we're all trying to harness a little of that. So that's all I have for now, but I'm happy to take any questions.
How long take for a refugee obtain the work permit?
That's a great question. My understanding is lately it's been taking about 2 to 3 months to get their work permit, but technically they are eligible to work upon arrival. It's just doing a little education with the employers to make sure they understand what paperwork they're able to accept.
We have a question for one of our virtual attendees. Are displaced asylum seeking families who are not a part of the resettlement programs eligible for cultural orientation and case management services?
It depends on where they're from, unfortunately. Some countries or some immigration statuses provide you different benefits. But cultural orientation, we do those at JBS for anyone.
There's also a program called Refugee Support Services. So that's from 6 months after arrival all the way up to 5 years. That after they've arrived during that period of time, we can provide social services, let's say. And if families do want to receive ELL or they want to see cultural orientation, we can help with that. And that's something we're working on the Missouri side. See where are all the English courses and where are these things to be able to provide that information for folks like that.
Perfect, thank you. Another question. Does anybody else have another one before I jump in? Oh, okay. How can someone help connect asylum seekers to legal services for guidance in the U or T visa process?
I think there's a lot of clinics in Kansas City, Asylum Clinic KC, Asylum Clinic KC, or the clinic at Sharma Crawford, immigration law offices. So you can reach out to any of us, I think, and we will be able to, in Catholic Charities. Has a clinic maybe?
We take a few asylum cases a year. Asylum cases are really difficult to take. They take a lot of resources. So generally they're usually done by law firms, but we do take a few cases every year.
One of the main ones is Asylum Clinic, though. The attorney is Claire Murphy Shaw.
Yeah.
Spot on. I would recommend that.
A good starting point.
Exactly. But we do assist at JVS, we do assist victims of trafficking. So T visas, we do have a small program.
Okay, so I'm sitting in the back of the room and I thought, Casey, I heard you say an Afghan refugee is not eligible for any of the benefits. I just wanted to make sure I heard that clearly.
So I think to clarify who we're talking about here, there's probably 3 categories that Afghans are going to arrive with. They're either going to come as Afghan refugees through the Refugee Resettlement Program, or they're going to come as SIV, Special Immigration Visa holders, which will also come through the resettlement program. And then there's this 3rd category of humanitarian parolees. And those are also Afghans that have been evacuated out and come to the United States. That 3rd category, they will only be eligible for medical insurance so far until September 30th, and children under 18 will be eligible for SNAP benefits. But my understanding at this point is no other benefits have been extended, and we're hopeful that things will change soon.
It's a matter of designation.
So we will not be doing, you're specifically talking about your refugee health screening program that we work with. Yeah.
I just want to make sure
We'll be very much clarifying who these folks are when they're sent to your office, to your clinic. We have not had any arrivals yet, so we're still kind of working through the nuances of that. And these folks are not doing the standard refugee health assessments that other refugee arrivals would. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I just saw that you're potentially getting 7 o'clock. We're really anxious.
Great. Yeah. I think this is a conversation that we need to continue to have with both your clinic and with Vibrant, because we know that families are going to be arriving with medical conditions and they're going to need to seek care. And so figuring out what the services and what the referral system looks like, I think is really going to.
About that, I've got women's church group, right? And so they can advocate. So I just want to make sure overall I was clearly okay.
Right now, that would extend those benefits, that folks showing their support for people being eligible for those services.
Great. Can you repeat that? I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I was just saying, just to reinforce what Casey said, the White House has put forward a proposal to Congress about the need for Afghan parolees to be eligible for these benefits and services. And so that is an active proposal. And so as Casey said, in addition to the individual, partnership conversations that you all be having, the extent to which folks feel compelled to advocate on those needs is certainly welcome.
I have a question. I understand this current situation is unique, but on average, if a refugee family has to be placed with a family in the community for short-term housing, on average, how long is that commitment to house the refugee family?
So I will say that JVS normally does not do that. And we're not looking into doing that now. I don't know if Catholic Charities has that model.
We do not. No, I don't think anybody's doing host families at this point.
Okay.
I think it's something that every resettlement agency is looking at because we're in the middle of a housing crisis. And it's just going to be a larger influx of people than we had anticipated. So I think people are thinking about it, but I don't know that anybody at this point has moved on that yet.
Last resort.
Thank you.
And the reasoning is folks have had temporary residents or just transient residents. So when people arrive here, what we want to do is, again, be hospitable and welcoming in the sense that they have their own place now. So that's something we've heard on the radio, on the news, personally over the phone, that folks are offering their home, and it is very generous. I mean, that is hospitable, but it would be the last resort. What we need help with is if you have friends and family and colleagues that have housing, actual apartments or houses for our refugee families, that's really where we need help to get them settled. Yeah.
Or even just getting a group together and purchasing vacuums or microwaves or AC units or couches or thrifting those things to furnish homes. Yes.
Are there requirements for the housing, like what you need to have set up in a house for a refugee to move in and live there?
Are there requirements for furnishings, table service, beds, how big the house is, square foot, avoiding slumlord situations? I mean, how much money is there for a refugee to rent a house, and how long does the agency or the federal government pay for that? And when do the refugees have to assume paying for rent?
So
all that stuff.
I think that is a loaded question, Donna.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yes.
So yes, there are requirements about what is deemed safe and affordable housing, and there are guidelines to help us decide and differentiate between the types of housing we're looking at to make sure that it is safe and affordable. There are a specific list of items that must be available for families. Now, we're really fortunate that we get a ton of donations. So typically families don't pay for any of the furniture or the household items that they would need. And I mean, it includes everything from a bed to like a bathroom wastebasket. So it's very specific and covers everything that you would need for a fully functioning house. And so we're able to provide many of those things free of cost to families. But yes, it is an extensive list. And I think there was one more question wrapped in there.
Then is there an allocation for rent, and
So-
how long is that provided before they have to assume?
So
that
there's no
financial cost?
specific like funds allocated specifically for housing. What they get is that 1025 to 1225 per person. That's a one-time like payment at first that they receive, and then they're eligible for cash assistance. So between those two funds, ideally they're going to be able to afford housing for 3 to 6 months. That's not always the case, which is why we tap into some emergency funds and private funds. But generally, that's why we focus so much of our attention on employment, because it's going to be really difficult for families to pay their rent and utilities without, accessing employment fairly quickly.
Right, and one of the cultural orientation classes deals with budgeting, so that they can learn what to do with their funds, and the fact that, at 90 days, maybe you will have to pick up the rent, so they can learn those skills quickly.
In general, I'm just curious, do refugees, once they are faced with all these, things cost a lot in America. And so when they start understanding that, do they get
panicked?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is really stressful. I think there's a lot of stress on families to work and to do that. But to be honest, like, we don't see a lot of evictions with refugees. Like, they understand that this is their chance to start anew and to make a new way for themselves. Many of them come with small children or families, and they're just so focused on becoming successful that we see people get employed within 60, 90 days. And usually by the time most people are exiting that 90 day, they've at least found employment or are about to start a new job. So we've seen a lot of success with families, to be honest. Yeah. Greg, I think I saw.
I think there was a question there.
I was wondering, you guys mentioned for the first 90 days that you you guys offer English services for work. Are these like one-on-one, and is it a volunteer or how does that work?
Yeah, it varies. Pre-COVID, larger classes. Now COVID, we offer, or even over WhatsApp. There's a class. We have small social distance classes on site, and we are looking towards how to do things more virtual now. And yes, we definitely can use volunteers to do English classes. That's for sure. Yes.
I think Della and Catholic Charities are really lucky. They have an in-house ESL classes. We do not. So we rely a lot on community partners. So Literacy KC or Don Bosco or the library. Thankfully, last week we just met with Don Bosco and Literacy KC, and they're going to open up classes just for JVS. So virtual classes or in-person classes, and different days for enrollment for just JVS clients, so that there are classes for them to learn a little bit of English while they're still without employment and gaining those skills. But also the library provides one-on-one tutoring.
I think this is a question from the audience, but this is going to be the last question, so we can stay to the time. How many refugees do you anticipate, or each of your organizations anticipate, within the next coming months?
So I will tell you what we said we can handle. So we said that we are able to resettle 300 Afghan evacuees and about 400 refugees within the next fiscal year. So from October 1st to September 30th of next year.
And we've agreed to take initially 75 evacuees and 225 refugees. However, we are all, I think, pretty aware that the numbers of evacuees are going to have to increase. I think when we look at the 9 resettlement agencies and the capacity that they shared with the State Department, they were below how many people we actually know are going to be coming. So I think agencies will increase their capacities a little bit here and there. I think that's likely to happen.
Yeah, and for us, we said we were open to resettling 250 of the Afghan evacuees and 175 for the year. But the thing is, and we've been saying this to people, I mean, I know we're on record, but we're not on record in a way, because this is a mutual discussion that we have through our resettlement agencies. You guys are, okay, so through our resettlement agencies, and they discuss with the Department of State, what is the local capacity? And then that then gets sent back. Okay, this is how much. So as Kristen mentioned, we're at the end of the federal fiscal year. So all that stuff is happening. She probably knows more than we do because it's over there in Washington and all that stuff. And then we'll kind of be able to know in October and be able to give that number with a little more definition.
And I think just to add to that also, like, when we talk about whatever, how many 225 refugees Catholic Charities will resettle, like that is a year-long projection. So that goes from October 1 to September 30th. When we're talking about the Afghan evacuees, we understand that the bulk of the arrivals will come in October, November, and December, and then slowly start to slow down as we get towards the end of March. So we anticipate a lot of activity with the evacuees, and probably a little bit slower regular refugee resettlement at the beginning of this federal fiscal year, and that will serve more folks from the refugee community farther down in the year. Or we'll get them all at the same time and we'll figure it out. I would say the reception and placement program is probably one of the most like topsy-turvy programs I've ever worked in, because it's just, there's a lot of changes. There's not always a lot of lead time. Right now, we're being notified of families arriving. We usually verify a case within 24 hours, and they might be traveling within 48 hours. So we're having some quick turnaround times to prepare for these arrivals, and that's very unique. That's not generally how resettlement is done. So there's a lot of different unique challenges, but we're really, I think, all 3 of our agencies have been doing this work for a really long time. We have a lot of committed staff. We're really excited about the opportunity to serve in this new way. But we'll probably need every community member that is interested to be involved with us to make it happen.
Okay, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate, Kristen, you making the travel arrangements and getting here to speak today. It was wonderful. And thank you 3 for being here and explaining the on the ground, what's going on. It's been wonderful to have you here. I hope you'll feel free to contact any of the agencies to figure out how you can be of assistance, talk to people in the community, help people understand what this is all about, and we'll continue the dialogue. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Della. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. You stay here, go down there.